Well, there you have it. President William Ruto just giving his opening remarks ahead of the plenary sessions that are set to be held at the Kenyatta International Convention Center. It is day 3 of the Africa Climate Summit, and just borrowing from what the president said, of course, a lot of focus needs to be put in terms of renewable energy, combating climate change, even within the counties. Just borrowing from the president right there, his conversation with the Nairobi County Governor Johnson Sakaja on dealing with waste management within the county. So it's all to do with having honest conversations, as the host president said. So I want to have an honest conversation right here with stakeholders in the climate change space. Their expectations around the Africa Climate Summit, have the expectations been met, and what exactly do they make of the Nairobi Declaration? And equally, climate financing, which is a big deal right now. We saw a couple of pledges made on the course of the 2 days, and will this actually just be lip service, or will they walk the talk? So allow me to introduce my guest. Joining me in studio, I have Clive Mutunga, who is the USAID-funded Build project at AFIDEP. He's the director right there. It's great to have you. Karibu sana to the show.
Thank you.
I'm sure it's been a busy 2 days, the third day today, yeah?
It has.
You've been involved in the Africa Climate Summit?
Yes, I've been involved in a number of sessions planning for the African Climate Summit,
yes,
and even some other events that have been held in the region in run-up to the African Climate Summit.
Talk to us briefly about what AFIDEP does. What do you do as a director there?
AFIDEP in full is the African Institute for Development Policy. We are research and policy organization which ensures that evidence is used consistently in policy making and formulation in Africa. We know for many years policies, and this will also be some of the pieces that I'll be talking as it comes to African Climate Summit and the deliberations thereafter, is that policy, we are known to develop good policies, but in many cases, many of these policies don't get to be implemented, and they don't, in some of the cases, they don't use the right data and evidence. So AFIDEP comes to that space where we are really working with stakeholders at the regional and national levels to ensure that data and evidence use is used consistently, and it becomes a habit. I lead a project called Build, which is funded by USAID, and Build is an activity that works at the intersection of broader issues of population health, environment, and development, including climate change. So working with stakeholders to build and strengthen capacities of our stakeholders in Africa and globally to be advocates, to communicate on and promote cross-sectoral approaches that address sustainable development issues globally, but more also in Africa and Asia.
Okay, well noted. And it's proper you pointed out, implementation is usually the key concern right here, because they say on paper we're good, but in terms of implementation, we need to do better. We'll talk about that. Allow me to introduce the next guest, Charles Kabiswa, who's the CEO of Regenerate Africa. Charles, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Good morning.
Good morning, Rogers. And
to us about what Regenerate does as well.
Yeah, Regenerate, we are mainly focusing on Africa transitioning to a regenerative development, okay, and we support communities and landscapes on regenerative agriculture and land management and climate and renewable energy. We work a lot on forest and wetlands and water resources management, as well as intersecting gender health and environment. But also we do a lot of work on nature business and nature-based enterprises or business that are thriving within nature, okay, across different landscapes.
Interesting. So different stakeholders definitely putting in their weight and pushing their weight in this Africa Climate Summit. I'll start with you, Charles. Today is the third day, and it's been a busy 2 days. We've seen various heads of states, stakeholders fly in, even those who come from Kenya and within the East African region, contribute in terms of matters climate change. In terms of your expectations and the reality on the ground, because you're taking part in the Africa Climate Summit, have your expectations been met, or are we on course to meeting those expectations?
I would say the turn-up is so overwhelming, and the participation on top leadership, like the Africa heads and the people in the climate agenda across Africa are all represented in there. And also the multi-sectoral participation for people from businesses, non-government organizations, government, media, civil society, it's all doing so well. We've gotten some, of course, pledges. The declaration has been mentioned already in different media, but also the President Ruto and others have been in for this. So we seem to be on track, but again, some of us are still not so convinced, because over and over we've been participating in a number of conferences, the UNFCCC, the COPs, but of course there are so many exciting declarations, exciting frameworks, and there are so many pledges, but the commitment is actually the problem. And we hope that maybe this being the Africa-led with a united voice, we want to see things done differently. Otherwise, the climate is felt, but finances are not felt on the ground, especially in the landscapes and communities, rural women and farmers that we are working for. And I think for me, this is something that I'm looking forward for, but let's see how it goes. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Clive, do you have the same regards into matters climate, that too much lip service, perhaps we need to walk the talk? What say you?
I agree, and I want to echo what my brother Charles said. I feel overall we are feeling great that we are moving towards a common African voice, matters climate, and a big realization that as we move forward into climate action, Africa has to lead, and we have to provide leadership and solutions. At the end of the day, it's really translating what is passed in these big summits at the regional, the global level, into solutions that really impact the lives and livelihoods of the many people impacted by the effects of climate change. We are waiting to see the declaration later today. I know some of us, for instance, it's great to see some of the participation of sectors that have not been mainstream in climate action and negotiations. For instance, I will talk about the health sector. The health sector has not been very active in climate, and the sector generally has not been recognized and prioritized as part of climate action. And it's great to see several ministers of health participate for the first time in a convening of this nature. And we hope that their voices will be heard and reflected in the final declaration. Right now, for the first 2 days, I've heard the community, the health sector community, voice some concerns if the issues will be featured, but there's great momentum even from the UNFCCC and the presidency, the UNFCCC COP28 presidency, to bring health into the attention of climate change action.
Okay, speaking of commitments, Charles, what exactly needs to be done to ensure that these rich, developed countries pull their weight in terms of honoring the commitments that have been made in the course of many declarations, from the Paris Agreement all the way to the COP27? What needs to be done so we move away from talking to actually actions? Yeah.
Yes, it is money. It is money coming into the pockets of communities that are in need. You know, vulnerability of climate is much felt in Africa, and yet we are not the polluters. So the guys who are polluting the environment are supposed to pay, and these are the commitments that have been made. But over and over, it's the very minor, slight percentage that comes to Africa. So it is something that we need to keep pushing. But I thought it would be kind of a common sense for these countries to commit, because a pledge is a pledge, and all we want to see is money in Africa, money to the rural people, money to support green investments, agroforestry, farmers, forestry work, and any other. I think even of recent they are talking more with the climate, the carbon funds, or carbon crediting, or carbon financing. All of these should come into play as quickly as possible. So we just really want to walk into action. It has been talking and talking and talking, and we hope that the pledges that we are seeing right now are all not following the same trend of talking without action.
Well, I'm looking at the front page of the Standard here, Clive, and I can see a number of pledges. You know, Africa Development Bank pledges, 3.6 trillion shillings towards climate finance by 2025, 655 billion shillings from the COP28 president designate. So we're talking about hefty sums in terms of the pledges that are being made. But let's start from an understanding point of view. I was coming to work and the driver I was in the car with actually asked, "Imambo ya carbon tax ni nini?" What exactly does carbon credit actually mean, and how will we as Africans benefit from these concepts? Perhaps break it down for us as a stakeholder so we understand we're all at the same page.
Sure, thanks, Rogers. I think it's so important to break down some of the jargon that we use in these conversation spaces to reflect what that means to someone in the ground, to the woman, young person who is in my village in Makueni, for instance. And there's so much excitement actually about the carbon credits and the carbon markets.
Yeah.
When we are waiting for this show to start, I was chatting with my brother Charles, and when we saw the big pledges from the donors, one of the questions we were asking ourselves is this new funding, is this new money, or it is just a restatement of funding that has been probably committed in some other, in other form? The fact is that these funds need to be additional, and they need to translate into actions that make sense to communities, to the people who are facing the impacts of climate change. Carbon credits, a lot of interest in Africa. For many countries, my office is in Lilongwe, Malawi, and the government of Malawi just set up a national carbon credit scheme. And the Kenya government recently passed a carbon bill. But the mechanisms to put this into place to really get people to benefit from it, and there are great benefits. For instance, some of the work communities are doing around afforestation, where they are planting trees to promote their landscapes, to promote their health. But by doing so, because trees act as carbon sinks for climate, they could actually get carbon credits by so doing. So some of these activities are just obvious development activities, and communities are already engaging them. So there's a great advantage of us really coming up with good structures, mechanisms to take advantage of these opportunities to benefit the people. The carbon market is one great example. We know, for example, in Kenya, the president committed to about 15 billion trees. So those trees can actually benefit several farmers who are also doing like agroforestry. So there's a co-benefit, and looking at it from the co-benefit also is a good way to look at it, because these farmers are already doing it. They are using agroforestry to enrich fertility of the soils of their farms, but bringing in the carbon market will actually enhance their incomes and their productivity, contribute to climate change, but also contribute to other development outcomes, including food security, water resource management, and the like. So looking at it from the cross-sectoral space gives us an impetus to implement these activities.
Okay. And I'm still struggling to get what exactly is the thinking behind carbon credit. In layman's language, for someone who's back at home watching and trying to understand what exactly this entails, kindly break it down for us.
So I'll try to break it down, and maybe my brother will help me as well, because he does the landscape work. It's because the cause of climate are carbon emissions and other gases, which have been increasing over the years, and there's a need to reduce the emission of those gases. So one way through which these gases can be reduced is the basic science that most of us did in East Africa, for example, photosynthesis, where plants are able to use sunlight and absorb carbon dioxide. So the more trees, and of course this also matters in terms of the different species, they will be able to act as carbon sinks.
Okay.
So by planting trees just as a good development practice, you're actually contributing into reducing emissions. So because some countries are already contributed a lot in production of these emissions, they can actually you can actually trade carbon in a market like you do trade for a regular product or service, where for people who are already, that's where carbon finance comes in. Some of the farms in the developed countries can buy credits which can be converted from some of the activities that farmers are doing, like planting trees, that can be converted into carbon credits. So farmers will get to earn money by just planting trees, and then some of the industrial nations will be able to put in funds to do that as part of their efforts to contribute to reduction of emissions.
Okay.
So it's a bit complicated, especially when it goes to the global markets, because carbon has to be priced like just any other commodity, and it has to be traded in sort of like a virtual market. So you bundle all the carbon and then you provide credits, which basically is funding, which is supposed to trickle down to communities of farmers who are actually doing the plantation. So they will actually, for instance, say for you to sequester a certain amount of carbon, and you planted an acre of, let's say, a certain indigenous species, you are entitled to this much per year. Okay. So it sort of translates into real money, which flows into people's accounts, whether you're in Kenya through their M-Pesa, and they are just doing the usual development interventions.
Okay. It would be proper to note if at policy level we're at par in terms of African countries embracing that particular concept. Now to the professor of this matter, Charles, explain to us how Africans, especially back at home, the farmers, those who actually work on the farms, planting trees and whatnot, how exactly they can contribute and benefit from this carbon credit.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion, because we've got, of course, some environmental activists, and especially in the climate justice, are bringing out arguments that this is not just, because you want the developed countries to keep polluting, and then compensation is done with a rural farmer, for instance, who does tree planting, or who is engaged in saving, using maybe improved cook stoves at household level, institutional level. So there is that conversation. But when I was chatting with Clive just before we came in here, we said, but like a tree planting agroforestry, so this is the nature, it is the normal that our communities are doing. Hopefully, if this is a supplementary income that comes in, I think it is not bad. So, but again, that conversation is on, and I think even in the Africa Climate Summit, there has been a marching to say we don't need to see that money, like that wouldn't be the best pathway for development. But for us, we think it would be some kind of a benefit, a co-benefit to the farmers who are already doing that. So, but of course, there are a lot of mechanisms. Getting to the policy, we do not yet have streamlined regulations on the carbon pricing, carbon mechanism. I think that is where we have a problem, that we more depending on voluntary carbon buyers, and we don't have regulations. Uganda is coming up with some of the laws, hopefully Tanzania and Kenya, but again, this is not yet in there, and we are struggling to explain it. A rural farmer in Isiolo and in Amudat in Karamoja or in Karagwe, Tanzania, they can hardly understand just the same problem with the general concepts of climate. So I think the simplification of this is one of the ways, also building much into the indigenous understanding or knowledge, or connecting the science and the indigenous knowledge would be something very, very important. But it is something that we appreciate, and I've seen countries like UAE even pledging within this session that is going on, especially on the carbon trading. Okay,
interesting. So at least we've understood what exactly carbon trading, carbon credits are. Back to you, Clive. And something that the president of Kenya, the host president, said yesterday stuck with me. Until the lion learns how to ride, the story will always glorify the hunter. In terms of Africa not just being on the menu, but taking its space on the table right now. And while they were speaking about this, different aspects of debt came into the picture. And I want to ask you about this in terms of the call for debt relief of African countries. How important is this in this all-important journey towards combating climate change?
Thanks. I think debt is an important player when it comes to climate change. Many of the countries in Africa, if we are to take leadership as a continent in climate change, there are several issues that need to be fixed, cutting across broader macroeconomic and physical reforms that need to happen. We know many of these countries are highly indebted, getting out of debt, trying to struggle with issues around unemployment, high inflation, some of which is actually tied to climate change, because we've seen year after year ministries of finance and treasury having to adjust countries' economic growth projections downwards because of climate change. And we know how that sort of constrains the fiscal space of governments to be able to invest in the various development sectors. So there's been a paradigm called debt for nature, which is basically discussions with different lenders that all the different African countries owe to restructure the debt as they invest in climate friendly development. And we've seen this take steam in this summit, and I think it's something that we as a continent would want to look into. If you look at there are good examples of effective schemes where debt for nature swaps have worked. A good example is the Brazilian Amazon, where many of the lenders came together to institute programs that helped the Brazilian government and other countries in the Southern America, in the Amazon basin, to come up with debt for nature swaps. And those countries have moved forward in terms of trying to fix their macroeconomic challenges by these investments. Again, it sort of lends the same corollary as the carbon markets. You are basically within the global financing structure, letting countries off the debt, which in some of the cases wasn't invested well in human and capital development, to really now focus their investments in green growth, green economic jobs, trying to create jobs for young people. So I think that's an important step that countries are really looking forward to be part of these conversations.
Okay, that's really proper. Anything to add on the debt issue?
I am a bit skeptical on the debt for nature swap. I hope it doesn't now dominate the pledges. You know, it's like you have a rural farmer struggling. We need new money coming in. Some of this debt for nature swap actually not so much working with smallholder farmers. Probably therefore government, and also the government has to be transparent enough and accountable, which is also a struggle in most of our African countries. And again, some of these are actually tailored to the big companies like renewable energy companies. But again, it's like having a pledge on a pledge. You know, we are having so many pledges. Already we have previous pledges not fulfilled. So there's always a mix. We need new monies tailored to the most vulnerable population. We are talking about farmers, smallholder farmers, people in the islands, agro-fishers, somewhere in Siaya or Homa Bay, those ends where we just want that to be felt. But this would be a mechanism, but it's not so attractive for us who live with the communities in those landscapes. Okay. We hope other mechanisms that have been on before, like the pledges, we should be fast-tracked and try to ensure that we reach out to those landscapes. Otherwise, the climate is not waiting for any of those processes. We just need to move very, very fast and very, very quickly. Okay,
interesting. Allow us to take a short break, gentlemen. We'll continue with the conversation right here in studio. But of course, our camera lenses are equally trained on the Africa Climate Summit happening at KICC We'll be crossing over once any developments start on that particular end, even as we get an update from our reporters on the ground. Allow us to take a short break. We'll be back with matters to do with climate. Stay with us.